Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the second day for CHI. Thank you for joining us at our second keynote presentation. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Ruha Benjamin, who is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and author of People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier. We're delighted to have Ruha here today. She studied the social dimensions in science, technology, and medicine for over 15 years, and speaks widely on issues of innovation, equity, health, and justice in the US and really around the world, like she's doing today. She's also a faculty associate in the Department for Sociology and serves on the executive committees of the Program in Global Health and Health Policy, and also the Center for Digital Humanities. We're delighted Ruha is able to spend the time with us today, and we're looking forward to hearing from her. She's currently working on her next book, which is called Viral Justice: How We Grow the World We Want, born out of the twin plagues of COVID-19 and police violence, a double crisis that since created a portal for rethinking all we've taken for granted on this planet and on the social order and life that we have today. Please join me in welcoming Ruha. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to be in conversation with the CHI community. Good morning to everyone, afternoon, evening. I've organized my talk into two parts. The first one, engaging questions and issues that I see raised in the field of HCI and design more broadly. And the second one, situating these concerns in a wider context, implicating racism, inequality, and technology. So part one, I'll begin with a little time travel, taking you with me to March 2020 and what feels like a lifetime ago. We were about 2 weeks into the pandemic here in Princeton, New Jersey, and my husband and I teamed up with our local bookstore, Labyrinth, to offer stories from around the world online to whoever wanted to tune in. Now that our sons are teenagers, it was a good excuse for us to dig out our favorite children's books and to discover new stories on Labyrinth's shelves. Plus, I'll take any reason to put on my Catwoman Halloween glasses and make funny faces in front of the camera. Labyrinth publicized the daily event on their listserv, so we were expecting people in our general area. But as acquaintances caught wind of it on social media, our audience expanded to other states and even a few other countries, with about 40 families tuning in that first day. Just towards the end of the session, I was finishing up one of my favorite silly stories called Walter the Farting Dog, when suddenly I noticed an image pop up on the screen showing a cartoonish white man in a thong with his genitals bulging. I froze at first, confused about what was happening. I didn't know if only we were seeing the image or whether it was being projected to everyone. Then after a few seconds, a man's voice could be heard repeating the N-word multiple times. At which point we realized this was a malicious attack. It turned out to be one of the first widely publicized cases of what quickly became known as Zoom bombing, though I'd never heard of the term before that week. In our case, the hijacker had taken advantage of two things: the fact that we had publicized the link for the story to anyone interested instead of limiting access to a select or registered few, and the fact that the default setting on Zoom at the time allowed all participants to share what's on their screens with the group, replacing the host's own camera feed. We know that these settings reflect the fact that Zoom transformed from being used as a primarily office-based system to a global social outlet practically overnight. And while Zoom bombing incidents may have initially been regarded as pranks or trolling, they quickly rose to the level of hate speech and harassment. Just weeks after my own experience, an analysis by the New York Times found 153 Instagram accounts, dozens of Twitter accounts, and private chats, and several active message boards on Reddit and 4chan, where thousands of people had gathered to organize Zoom harassment campaigns, sharing meeting passwords and plans for sowing chaos in public and private meetings. It wasn't that Zoom's founder, Eric Yuan, wasn't aware of security issues. It was a choice to weigh convenience more than and limiting friction. Those who designed the system prioritized an easier and frictionless user experience over security. But convenient and frictionless for who? Which users? Stepping back from my own particular experience, I wonder whether the pursuit of frictionless UX reinforces and hides everyday social frictions, like the racist and sexist harassment many of us experience online before Zoom bombing. Is technological ease and speed inversely related to social progress, encouraging us to skip deeper reflection and analysis of the context in which both humans and computers reside? The philosopher Sylvia Wynter notes that there are different genres of humanity, but that we too often conflate the dominant genre, the man, with humanity as a whole. The man, who is gendered, raced, classed, able-bodied, and so on, stands in for the wide variety of ways that people move in the world, the many ways of being human. What would it look like to not only design from the perspective of those who are routinely hampered by a hostile social system, but to draw on their insights, imagination, and expertise from the very beginning? As Carrington and Dillahunt note in this CHI 2021 paper, when potential harm to Black and Brown communities is an afterthought, HCI research is tasked to study how to alleviate harm or expand inclusion after system deployment, and considering communities of color after development, as opposed to them being considered architects of the initial innovation. Similar to the idea of frictionless design, minimalist design has a history and a politics. Last year, as monuments to white supremacy were being toppled in the wake of protests for racial justice in the United States, the renowned graphic designer Cheryl D. Miller was asked, so what is the rebel flag or the Confederate monument of design? She responded that the dominant aesthetics associated with minimalist sophistication have an altogether different meaning to her. I would like to retire the Paul Rand look. I would like to retire mid-century Helvetica. I want to retire flush left. I want to retire white space. It is the look of my oppressor, a mid-century era when it wasn't easy to enter the New York marketplace as a Black designer. When I see that look, the only thing it says to me is, you cannot enter. You don't belong. You're not good enough. Another way to put this is that the white space of design aesthetics reflects the white space of design worlds, or simply, the white space of design reflects the white space of design. It turns out this is not just a personal interpretation unique to Miller, but started as a political choice intended to reinforce hierarchies, which then became naturalized as simply good design over time. Indeed, science and technology are powerful tools for naturalizing racist and sexist hierarchies, a point to which I'll return. So, a question for us: how can we denaturalize racist hierarchies? As a first step, we need to know how these hierarchies were constructed in the first place. In an essay published last month by Jarrett Fuller, he reminds us that in 1910, the architect and essayist Adolf Loos wrote that ornamentation was primitive and decoration was for degenerates. His entire essay, based on a racist cultural superiority repeatedly uses words like criminal, amoral, and barbarian to describe ornament, comparing the arts and crafts from indigenous populations to that of children. He called for a society to move beyond these old ways into modernity. The evolution of culture, he wrote, is synonymous with the removal of ornament, he claimed. There is a parallel history that I won't get into here about how the early architects of scientific thinking worked to remove ornamental or flowery writing from scientific texts. Any hint of the first person subjectivity of the author was seen as a distraction, delegitimizing scientific claims for an already ambivalent public. In the same way that scientific writing eschews ornamental writing, science has eschewed non-white, feminized, and working class people. How convenient that the very humans science has objectified are deemed not objective. Only one genre of humanity, the man, could be trusted to give us scientific facts by ventriloquizing nature, in the same way that only one genre of humanity has monopolized the white space of technological design. Fortunately, a critical reckoning with this racist history is giving rise to new initiatives excavating and retelling stories that have been erased or distorted, including this recent book on a history of Arab graphic design. In Fuller's words, the idealization of minimalism erases the vernacular of local cultures and the plurality of human experience, race, gender, class, reinforcing the myth that design decisions are neutral while creating aesthetic hierarchies of good and bad design. What started as a utopian ideal leading us into an egalitarian future inevitably would become another system of oppression, pushing the tastes of the few onto the many. In fact, there's a 2021 CHI paper by Davis and Wenzel on the utility of ugly interfaces, which argues that flat UI design can be interpreted as a symbolic removal of the physical world or human from UI aesthetics. And it's not simply about taste, but about how dominant designs hide and perpetuate the violent frictions of our world. In The Longing for Less, Kyle Chayka argues that minimalism always obscures complexity. The minimalist interface you use to order your takeout, for example, sits above a complex network of gig workers that make sure your ramen is still warm when it arrives. The simple presentation hides the complicated system just below the surface, whether that is the infrastructure for data collection or the multi-conglomerate corporation or the labor violations upon which so much frictionless digital convenience rests. But less friction for some humans means more friction for others. As the authors of this 2019 CHI paper titled, "Who Gets to the Future?" write, as a discipline, HCI has taken steps to introduce policies and practices that remediate the effects of discrimination, yet rarely grappling with racism directly. This work raises questions of complicity within the field. To what extent do we as designers hide the workings of racism? To what degree do we learn to treat design techniques as portable without accounting for the legacies of racial struggle that surround them? With these questions and reflections in mind, I'd like to suggest a few ways forward. The first is to focus on everyday practices and pedagogy, the way things have always been done as a starting point, rather than focusing on how to use the tools of HCI to fix racism out there. Reckon with how racism has shaped everyday practices in here, from the questions deemed most interesting, the research that garners the most esteem, to the leadership, mentoring, and curricula, asking, how does this practice or pattern reinforce or subvert the status quo? Then when it comes to taking next steps, move beyond tokenistic and predatory inclusion. Tokenistic inclusion takes many forms, adding one team member of color to a research project or one or two articles by scholars of color to a syllabus that otherwise remains the same. This is the additive model, add color and stir. which doesn't upset the status quo. Predatory inclusion, in turn, may involve a more thoroughgoing inclusion, but what people are being included into is likely to harm them in the long run. Something to remember here is that plantations were diverse, but also violent. So diversity in itself does not guarantee human flourishing. Similarly, access to technology is not necessarily a good thing because, as the saying goes, what you have access to also has access to you, a point to which I'll return. Finally, imagining and crafting anti-racist systems that contribute to human flourishing is an ongoing process. People often ask me, so Ruha, can you give us an example of an anti-racist technology? And while I could, what defines it for me is how a tool is created, with what starting questions and assumptions. Who is involved? Who are we listening to and engaging? On this last point, I'm inspired by this 2020 CHI paper titled Critical Race Theory for HCI, which offers a number of concrete steps the community can take. The authors note that while there has been some research done on these issues, most of the work sees race as a characteristic of the researcher or the participant group that must be considered in design. Rarely does it go further into the broader context of race and technology. Treating race as a discrete variable, they write, in the design process often overlooks structural effects of race on design outcomes. Technological racism is not limited to face recognition and biased algorithms. Race should not be relegated to a niche topic in HCI, they write. Overall, theories that recommend strategies to address large populations often fail to incorporate or interpret inequalities, history, privilege, and power, and their impacts on people. In short, most of us still operate with a simplified understanding of race as a characteristic or property of individuals. You have a race, I have a race, we tick off on government forms, rather than as a feature of our social system, a founding political principle of modern life that justifies inequality, one that varies in different parts of the world, such that the way people are racialized is shaped by class, caste, culture, religion, language, and other social fault lines. But all of that becomes naturalized as an inherent characteristic of individuals. Race, we might say, is all about minimalism, a social technology for hiding complexity. And unless you're harmed by racist systems, it's hard to see beneath the slick branding of racial minimalism. But that's precisely what you must do and train yourself to do. Zooming the lens out, I find this insight by Black feminist writer Toni Cade Bambara instructive. Not all speed is movement. It reminds us that the market logics of tech innovation are not synonymous with social progress, that technology can just as well reflect and reproduce racial inequality if we fail to slow down and consider the social frictions that animate everyday life and not try to hide them. This point is often easier to grasp when we look to the past, as with this ad from a 1957 Mechanics Illustrated magazine. The robots are coming. And when they do, you'll command a host of push-button servants. Zooming in, it reads, in 1863, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but by 1965, slavery will be back. We'll all have personal slaves again. Don't be alarmed. We mean robot slaves. So much going on this one little page, but I'll just highlight two quick things before moving on. The first is to take note of this date and to think about what is happening in the social milieu, what changes are afoot in terms of gender and racial fault lines, who usually did the free and cheap domestic labor, dressing you, combing your hair, and serving meals in a jiffy, and how are they beginning to push back? How does this technology reflect the needs and the desires of those who continue to want access to that free and cheap labor? The second thing to note is this one little word. We'll all have personal slaves again. In that one word is encoded the interlocking systems of race, class, and gender, telling us who this technology is for, who is the imagined user. Without race, class, or gender ever being mentioned, we know that it is not the descendants of people who were enslaved the first time. So whether we're talking about the social inputs or the outputs, how this technology is circulating, this is the wider milieu, the power hierarchies that we have to enter into the frame of analysis. And so all of this in 1957, how does that apply today? At the very same time that Amazon ran, so in 2021, we seem to have come a long way when the most popular Super Bowl ad this year featured the actor Michael B. Jordan as the embodiment of Alexa. Here we find a Black woman user imagining Jordan as the sexy voice of her AI device, a far cry from robot slaves, or is it? When I saw the ad, three things came to mind. At the very same time that Amazon ran the Alexa ad, the company was trying to crush the unionization of mostly Black and Latinx workers in its Bessemer, Alabama warehouse. I wonder if you asked this Black woman and the many others who have to deal with oppressive work conditions what inclusive technology looks like, if a bubble bath with a sexy Black Alexa would top the list. In this way, cosmetic representation too often takes the place of substantive change in the real conditions of people's lives. The second thing that came to mind was the case of a Black computer scientist, Jason Mars, who runs a tech startup. When his company's smartphone app talks, it sounds like a helpful young Caucasian female, he said. So he wanted to try designing the app to sound more like him, but ultimately didn't, saying that there's a kind of pressure to conform to the prejudices of the world. When you are trying to make a consumer hit, he said, it would be interesting to have a Black guy talk, but we don't want to create friction either. First, we need to sell products. Friction. There it is again. The Super Bowl ad also brought to mind research by Christoph Bartnet and colleagues on how study participants, majority of whom identified as white, respond to darker and lighter robots. First, they noted that if robots have anthropomorphic features like eyes or face, people will often look at the color of the machine, and if asked to, they will assign the robot a racial category. They also reported that when asked to respond to a threatening robot or human, participants were faster to shoot an armed Black robot and human than they were to shoot their white counterparts. The study subjects were also faster to refrain from shooting unarmed white humans and robots than unarmed Black figures. I don't think there is an easy typology in which to fit these examples: Black Alexa, Bessemer workers, Jason Mars, and Black robots racially profiled, nor should there be. I think the way that race, class, gender, and embodiment converge with perceptions of threat and desire defy any easy appeal to inclusive design. And the more that conversational computing heads into hospitals, homes, schools, workplaces, senior care, and more, we will need researchers and practitioners asking how technology reflects, reproduces, and resists social oppression in varying ways. And that's where you come in. With that, I'm going to pause just a minute before heading into the second part of my talk by sharing a short video clip from a film titled Sleep Dealers by Alex Rivera. It offers another window into this way that global capitalism turns racialized populations into automata. In this case, depicting Mexicans not as migrant workers, but machines that work in the US without setting foot in this country.
So here's a clip, it's about 3 minutes long. In this scene, you'll see the character as he crosses the border for the first time. So you'll see he's in Mexico, but he comes to America in a new way.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquilas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo, sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa. Y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres van a estar en una chambota en San Diego. Muchacho, enchúfate. Tu futuro empieza hoy.
So in this world, as we see, migrant workers are replaced by robots who are controlled virtually by laborers in Mexico, carrying out a variety of jobs in construction, childcare, agriculture, and more. Not only is the tech invasive, as we just saw, but it allows unprecedented surveillance. So if a worker falls asleep for an instant, the computer wakes her up, registers the lapse, and docks her pay. Amazon warehouses on steroids. Over the course of the film, Memo Cruz starts working at one such factory, which are called sleep dealers because workers often collapse of exhaustion when they're plugged into the network too long. Also worth noting, the range of languages at the end, including a diverse range of humans, so a really illustrative of predatory intrusion. In this way, the film reminds us how the fantasy of some is the nightmare of others, and that embodiment does not magically cease to matter with automation, but can actually become more intensified, intrusive, and violent. It's worth recalling that the etymology of the Czech word robot is drawn from the Slav robota, which means servitude, hardship. And as anthropologist Kathleen Richardson observes, robots have historically been a way to talk about dehumanization. Sleep Dealers also brings to life an idea that technology captivates, fascinating, charming, and bewitching while potentially subduing and subjugating people. To engage this tension, we have to move past a techno-deterministic approach that often takes two forms. The first, what we might call the techno-dystopian narratives that surround us, that circulate. That the robots, automation, emerging technologies are going to bring everything bad. They're going to take away human agency. They're going to take away all the jobs. And so that's really the story that Hollywood loves to sell us. The other is that the robots are going to save us. They're going to make everything more efficient, more fair. If only we would outsource important decisions to AI and to automation. And this is really the story that Silicon Valley loves to sell us. And although these seem like opposing narratives, they have different endings, they share an underlying logic, this techno-deterministic logic that tends to obscure the human agents and agencies behind the screen. And as it stands, a very small sliver of humanity currently is designing and imagining our socio-technical systems. And so as a starting point, of course, we want to think about how to expand that. And the field of HCI has really been at the forefront of thinking about participatory design in that way. And so at this point, I'm going to transition to part 2 of my talk, considering how racism distorts our collective vision of which humans matter. Race, not simply, again, as a property of individuals, but a founding fiction and friction of our social world, distorting not only how we see others, but how we can make sense of the patterns in our institutions and even how we know ourselves at all levels, institutional, interpersonal, and internal. Racism has this distorting effect. And so when we think about mapping that onto different social arenas, I start with policing, of course, because this past year in particular, more people have become aware of the anti-blackness embedded in our systems of law enforcement. And while the more high-profile forms of anti-blackness and racist violence make the headlines and the hashtags, it's really the everyday behind closed doors forms that I want to shine a light on. Just one example here out of Miami, in which law enforcement used these faces for target practice, the faces of our brothers, our cousins, our sons, our fathers. And so it's really no wonder that these people, these individuals and communities are also the ones who face the brunt of racist violence when it comes to these same officers hitting the streets. At the same time that we shine a light on everyday anti-blackness, I also want us to excavate and to build upon everyday forms of anti-racism, individuals, groups, movements, professional societies, working together to resist and reimagine the racist status quo. In this case of Miami, what was interesting was that a group of radical clergy got together and created the hashtag "Use Me Instead." And then they put their own faces there as a way to call attention to the hypocrisy and the harm involved with this pattern and practice of police targeting. So we move from policing to preschool, our educational system, to think through how this distorting lens operates. This is a study out of Yale in which researchers put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers and then had them look at children playing together and then said, look for the challenging behavior. And the vast majority of the teachers' attention invariably went to the little Black kids in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other kids. They were hired child actors instructed on how to behave. So whether we're talking about profiling in adulthood or in childhood, we see this carceral continuum, this everyday anti-Blackness infects all of our institutions. But it's not as if we're just born with these distorting lenses. Well, I want to spend just a couple minutes pointing to the way that these distortions have been created, constructed over time, and the role of science and scientists in constructing this architecture in which we still live and inhabit. One figure of many I could point to is here, the French naturalist Georges Cuvier, who wrote, "The white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity," to which he, of course, compared the Negro race, marked by Black complexion, crest of woolly hair, compressed cranium, flat nose, the projection of the lower parts of the face and thick lips, evidently proximate to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which it consists have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. So there's a lot going on here with Cuvier. Again, we could spend quite a while unpacking. So I'm just going to highlight a couple things before moving on. One is to take note these twin pillars, if we imagine this racist architecture that has been erected over time, we can think about this polarity, this distinction between Blackness and whiteness as two of its main pillars, central pillars holding it up. For whiteness to understand its supposed superiority, it needs a foil, an other to which to compare. The second thing to note is that Cuvier and his colleagues weren't simply talking about these racist hierarchies in the abstract. Rather, they were mapping them onto something concrete, the body. In fact, every single part of the Black body has been dissected and put under the microscope, producing evidence of supposed inferiority. And so why is that? Because the more that we can think about these racist distinctions as fixed, immutable, inherent, God-given, the less likely we are to question them, much less try to change them. And so one of the first things we can all do yesterday is to begin to vigorously denaturalize this racist vision and division so that we can begin to dismantle this architecture with greater vigor. The last thing I'll point out, when we often hear these examples from the past, people respond that, we can't judge the past by our standards today. We're imposing our values onto the past. But of course, at every moment that there were those espousing racist ideas about human inferiority and superiority, there have been people who have worked to refute it. In fact, Cuvier's own student, Frederick Tiedemann, was very outspoken, publishing refutations against his teachers, the paradigms in which his teacher was trying to perpetuate, not only discussing the bigotry involved, but the scientific fallacies that animated Cuvier's vision. And so for the students listening, to me, that is a important lesson, that we don't simply carry on the paradigms from the past, but we question them and think about how they're either upholding or working to overturn social inequalities. So which comes back to our present, to think about how racist vision and division continues to be naturalized, how we continue to perpetuate it and make it seem as if these are immutable characteristics of people. Here's another quick example. The first time a Black man was on the cover of Vogue, he was meant to evoke this older image, this World War I propaganda poster, in which in that case, the mad brute was the German. But you see here in the choices that were made, LeBron's posture, his growl, all the way down to his sneaker choice is meant to evoke the brutishness of Blackness. And of course, he's not on that cover alone. Remember the twin pillars. And so Giselle is there in order to accentuate the racial and gendered divisions that are everywhere in our pop culture, from the cartoons that our children watch to the movies that get released year after year. These are not simply outmoded ways of seeing and perpetuating differences, but are ongoing, which of course brings us to technology, where we see all around us examples of our technical systems, both reflecting and reproducing these racist distinctions. A simple exercise, I'm sure all of you are by now familiar, going to your Google images and typing in the phrase unprofessional hairstyles. You'll see images on your left, professional hairstyles, images on your right. And you see this general pattern emerge in which Black women's natural hair is coded literally unprofessional, a la uncivilized, going back to Cuvier. And so thinking about how not only the algorithms, but the interfaces, not only how these judgments are encoded and perpetuated, but also in the way that people use different technologies. And so I want to take one step back now, and just to share with you how I became interested in these questions, because I think they go beyond emerging technologies to the everyday objects that we encounter. And I think that understanding the spectrum, rather than associating a lot of these problems simply with what is coming down the pipe, what's emerging, will help us have a better sense of how durable these inequities are, but also how we can begin to denaturalize and overturn them. So here is a simple example. It's just a park bench located in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. And on this particular trip, I was living in Boston. It was winter, February, and I just wanted to lay in the sunshine for about 20 minutes in between meetings. and quickly realized I couldn't lay down on the bench because of the way it was designed with these armrests at, at every few feet. And I thought, okay, well, there's lots of functional reasons why they're there, right? Literally to put your elbows on. When I was 9 months pregnant, and it could have helped me get up and down, or for the elderly, or also even to give a sense of privacy. If someone's sitting on one end, I might want to sit more readily on the other end. But I also recall that this is the Bay Area, where with the tech boom, the housing crisis has grown exponentially. And so I imagine perhaps these armrests also deter people from sleeping on the benches who might need to. And at first I thought, okay, Ruha, you're being a little paranoid. But after a little digging, I realized it's part of this much more widespread phenomenon, what some call hostile architecture. I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki, only one booty at a time, no laying down there. I found caged benches in France. And so in this case, the mayor put these benches out Christmas Eve, and the people in the town rallied together in 24 hours and had them removed, which reminds us that we don't simply have to put up with discriminatory design, but we can ensure that our public space and our public policies and our public life reflect our higher values. But my favorite example of this genre of benches is the spiked bench, in which you see here, you actually have to pay for the spikes to retreat. In this case, it was designed by a German artist to get people thinking about the spikes in our everyday lives, the way something can be nominally public. Here, anyone can use it, but unless you can pay, it's really not for you. And so to get us to think about the way that our social life is spiked, our healthcare, our education, other areas of our social world. And so for me, the spiked bench is a useful metaphor for us to think about discriminatory design, for us to ask, what spikes are we designing or inheriting in the things that we create? And I say inheriting because a lot of the time, we might not be the chief architects of whatever technical system we're creating. We might just be a team member. We might just be brought on once the design is set up. But I think we still have a responsibility. If someone hands you a spiked bench where you see that the way that it's designed is either harming or excluding, what is our responsibility as individuals to speak up and try to do something about it? And I think it's easier to recognize the spikes when it's in our face, when it's obvious, when it takes the shape of very explicit forms of discrimination, kind of like the Zoom example I started with, where the harassment is in your face. There's no questioning. Here's the N-word. Here I'm being targeted. I think it's harder for us to analyze and examine the spikes when they're more subtle, when they're encoded in the language of inclusion and diversity. Here's an image from Roderick Crook's paper, Times 30, which I encourage everyone to read. It shows a laptop with a rubber band around it, prohibiting students from using it, running counter to the idea that access to technology is key to alleviating educational disparities. Crooks finds that, quote, for the most part, tablet computers did not radically change classroom instruction routines in his fieldwork, except perhaps to add multiple disruptions in which unpaid student workers were called on to maintain the devices. By contrast, he writes, the administration found many uses for tablet computers in instituting disciplinary measures, including extensive surveillance and expansion of standardized testing. After all, what we have access to has access to us. But not only that, access to technology provided new opportunities, in this case, for punishment. Students sign a behavior contract that demands they carry their iPads at all times during school hours. And if they use it in unauthorized ways, they are forced to carry their tablets with this rubber band and note, student iPad detention. Racial and class disparities in our educational system provides the pretext for flooding school buildings with devices to address the digital divide. But devices in school buildings also create new reasons and methods to control young people. Recall what we saw in Sleep Dealers, where being plugged into the system is pitched as a great opportunity, but with serious costs, and where the frictionless convenience of some humans relies on the detention of others. Racism helps create the conditions and justification for this dynamic. So let me offer three main takeaways that tie together what I've shared so far and my closing thoughts. The first idea is this: racism and other systems of domination to which it relates is productive, not in the normative sense, not in the sense that racism is good, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. Because many of us are still taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple in the backwoods and outdated, rather than as innovative, systemic, diffuse, an attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, in the tech industry, forward-looking, productive. In my own field of sociology, we often say race is socially constructed, but we often fail to state the corollary, that racism constructs. Secondly, I'd like us to really think about the way that race and technology shape one another, because more and more people are accustomed to thinking about the social and ethical impacts of technology, but that's only half of the story. Social norms, values, structures all exist prior to any given tech development. So it's not simply the impact, but the inputs that make some inventions appear inevitable and desirable, which leads to a third provocation, that imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a resource, a battleground, an input and output of technology and social order. In fact, we should acknowledge that most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, safety, and social control. Racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce a fragmented imagination, misery for some, monopoly for others. This means that for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one grounded in justice and joy, we can't only critique the underside, that is, who these systems harm. We also have to wrestle with the deep investment, the desire even that many people have for social control and domination. Consider this in light of a relatively new app called Citizen, which sends out real-time crime alerts based on a curated selection of 911 calls. It also offers a way for users to report, live stream, and comment on reported crimes via the app. And it'll show you incidents as red dots on a map so you can avoid particular areas, which is a slightly less racialized version of other apps called Ghetto Tracker and Sketch Factor, which use public data to help people avoid supposedly dangerous neighborhoods. Now, some of you who are familiar, especially with the US context of everyday racial profiling, you'll probably think, what could possibly go wrong with this in the age of barbecue Beckies, calling the police on Black people, cooking, walking, breathing, bird watching out of place? It turns out that even a Stanford-educated environmental scientist living in the Bay Area, no less, can be an ambassador of the carceral state, calling the police on a cookout at Lake Merritt. It's worth noting too that that app, Citizen, was originally called the less chill name Vigilante. And in its rebranding, it also moved away from encouraging people to stop crime, rather now simply to avoid it. As one member of the New York City Council put it, crime is now at historic lows in the city, but because people are constantly being bombarded with push notifications of crime, they believe the city is going to hell in a handbasket. Not only is this categorically false, it's distracting people from very real public safety issues like reckless driving or rising opioid use that don't show up on the app. What's most important to our discussion, I think, is that citizen and other tech fixes for social problems aren't simply about technology's impact, but also about how racial norms and values shape what tools are imagined necessary in the first place. This dynamic is what I take up in two new books. The first one examining the interplay between race automation and machine bias, and as an extension of older forms of racial domination. The second is an edited volume on the carceral dimensions of technology across a wide range of social arenas, from more traditional sites like policing and prisons to less obvious contexts like financial technologies, healthcare, and the digital service economy. In terms of popular discourse, what got me interested in these issues was the proliferation of headlines and hot takes like these about so-called racist and sexist robots. There was a first wave of stories a few years ago that seemed initially to be shocked at the prospect that, in Langdon Winner's terms, artifacts have politics. A second wave seemed less surprised. Well, of course, technology inherits its creators' biases. And now I think we've entered a phase of attempts to override or address the default settings of racist or sexist robots, for better or worse. And one of the challenges we face is how to meaningfully differentiate technologies that are used to differentiate us. Take, for example, a recent study. Racial bias in a medical algorithm favors white patients over sicker Black patients, reports Obermeyer and team, in which the researchers were actually able to look inside the black box of algorithm design, which is typically not possible with proprietary systems. What's especially important to note is that this algorithm does not explicitly take note of race. That is to say, it is race neutral. By using cost to predict healthcare needs, this digital triaging system unwittingly reproduces racial disparities because on average, Black people have incurred fewer costs for a variety of reasons, including systemic racism. And in my review of the study by Obermeyer, I argue that indifference to social reality on the part of tech designers and adopters can be even more harmful than malicious intent. In the case of this widely used healthcare algorithm affecting millions of people, more than double the number of Black patients would have been enrolled in programs designed to help them stay out of the hospital if the predictions were actually based on need rather than cost. So race neutrality, it turns out, can be a deadly force. And I think this applies well beyond the design of algorithms. The combination of coded bias and imagined objectivity is what I've termed the new Jim Code, innovation that enables social containment while appearing fairer than discriminatory practices of a previous era. And so to encourage us to think about how anti-Blackness gets encoded in and exercised through automated systems, I'm considering 4 conceptual offspring to the new Jim Code that fall along kind of spectrum, from the most obvious, engineered inequity, to the most insidious, techno-benevolence. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to dive a little deeper into the last 2 before moving towards a conclusion. So coded exposure names this tension between ongoing surveillance of racialized populations and calls for digital recognition and inclusion, the desire to literally be seen by technology. But inclusion into harmful systems is no clear good. Rather, the act of viewing something or someone can put the object of our vision at risk, a form of scopic vulnerability central to the experience of being racialized. What I'd like to underscore is that it's not only in the process of being out of sight, but also in the danger of being too centered that racialized groups are made vulnerable, though not without creative resistance, as I'll come back to in just a moment. But first, another 2-minute interlude, and then you'll get my closing thoughts.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Motioning. Please sense me.
One other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah. We replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's going to save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
The system doesn't see black people?
I know. Weird, huh?
That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
Nothing. We never should have let that white guy off.
We're 8 black men in an elevator. Of course the white guy's gonna get off. Veronica? Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good. I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Wow, that sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, yeah. She said they're working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Ty's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out of my neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
My white guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue, and he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand, within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people, by
Thursday, June 27th, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking.
Every person on earth, as if everyone can fall into that binary. So there's a lot to unpack there with the clip. Among other things, the show depicts how a superficial corporate diversity ethos, the prioritization of efficiency over equity, and the default whiteness of tech development work together to ensure that innovation literally produces containment. The fact that darker skinned employees are unable to use the elevators, doors, water fountains, or turn the lights on is all treated as a minor inconvenience in service to a greater good. This is the invisibilizing side of a process that Alondra Nelson describes as a dialectic between surveillance and neglect that characterizes Black life vis-a-vis science and technology. During the pandemic, the stakes of coded exposure have grown more pronounced. And one of the most tangible examples is the widespread use of the pulse ox by patients in their homes as a way to help them determine when to seek urgent care. As my colleague, Amy Moran Thomas, writes in this Boston Review piece, like the problems magnified by the coded gaze of algorithms elsewhere, even small racial disparities could amplify unequal outputs. Beyond the pulse ox, this also matters for other wearable chromatic devices and the algorithms they feed. Pretending that they're colorblind can further amplify how racism, not genetics, explains why Black Americans are dying of COVID-19. Which brings us to the last part of the spectrum, techno-benevolence. A number of interesting developments that aim to address bias in various ways. Take, for example, AI techniques for vetting job applicants. A company called HireView aims to, quote, reduce unconscious bias and promote diversity in the workplace by using a program that analyzes recorded interviews of prospective employees. It uses thousands of data points, including verbal and nonverbal cues like facial expression, posture, vocal tone, and then compares job seeker scores with those of existing top performing employees to decide who to flag as a desirable hire and who to reject. The sheer size of many applicant pools and the amount of time and money that companies pour into recruitment is astronomical. So companies like HireVue step into the mix and narrow the eligible pool at a fraction of the time and cost, and hundreds of companies worldwide have signed on. Another value added, according to HireVue, is that there's a lot that a human interviewer misses that AI can keep track of to make, quote, data-driven talent decisions. After all, the problem of employment discrimination is widespread and well documented. So the logic goes, wouldn't this be even more reason to outsource decisions to AI? Well, consider that question in light of a study by a Princeton team of computer scientists, which examined whether a popular algorithm trained on human writing online exhibited the same racially biased tendencies that psychologists have documented among humans. In particular, they found that the algorithm associated white-sounding names with pleasant words and black-sounding names with unpleasant ones. So too with gender-coded words and names, as Amazon learned a few years ago, actually, when its hiring algorithm was found discriminating against women. Nevertheless, it should be clear by now why technical fixes that claim to bypass human biases are so desirable. If only there was a way to slay centuries of racist and sexist demons with a social justice bot. Beyond desirable, more like magical. Magical for employers, perhaps, looking to streamline the grueling work of recruitment, but a curse for many job seekers. Whereas proponents describe a very human-like interaction, those on the hunt for jobs recount a very different experience. Forget the algorithmic bias for a minute. Even if you could train, let's say, affirmative action algorithms that flag those who are usually rejected, many people are still frustrated not only by the lack of human contact, but also because they have no idea how they're being evaluated. One job seeker described questioning every small movement and micro expression and feeling a heightened sense of worthlessness because, quote, the company couldn't even assign a person for a few minutes. The lack of transparency and accountability is a big part of the problem. And as this headline puts it, your next interview could be with a racist bot, bringing us back to that problem space we started with. Though it's worth noting that some job seekers are already developing ways to subvert the system by trading answers to employers' tests and creating fake applications as informal audits of their own. In fact, one HR employee for a major company recommends that people slip the words Oxford and Cambridge into our CVs with invisible white text to pass the automated screening. In terms of a more collective response, a federation of European trade unions called UNI Global has developed a charter of digital rights for workers, touching on automated and AI-based decisions to be included in bargaining agreements. Another development that keeps me somewhat hopeful is that tech workers themselves have increasingly been speaking out against various forms of corporate collusion with state-sanctioned racism. And there's a hashtag you can learn more, tech won't build it. For example, thousands of Google employees condemn the company's collaboration on a Pentagon program that uses AI to make drone strikes more effective. And a growing number of Microsoft employees are opposed to the company's ICE contract, which is the immigration enforcement group, saying that as the people who build the technologies that Microsoft profits from, we refuse to be complicit. In just the last few months, the Alphabet Workers Union, too, has been gaining momentum among workers at Google and beyond. So as this article published by Science for the People reminds us, contrary to popular narratives, organizing among technical workers has a vibrant history, including technicians and engineers in the 60s and 70s who fought professionalism, individualism, and reformism to contribute to radical labor organizing. The current tech workers movement, which includes students across our many institutions, can draw from past organizers' experiences in learning to navigate the contradictions and complexities of organizing in tech today, and which includes building solidarity across our many differences. For example, when the predominantly East African Amazon workers in the company's Minnesota warehouses organized a strike on Prime Day to demand better work conditions, engineers from Seattle came out to support. In terms of pedagogy, I'll also just mention one concrete resource that you all can download called the Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech Handbook, developed by some wonderful colleagues at the Data and Society Research Institute in New York. The aim of this intervention is threefold: to develop an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in algorithms, social media platforms, and technologies not yet developed; an emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations within organizations; and a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. In that spirit, initiatives like Data for Black Lives, the Detroit Community Technology Project, and the Design Justice Network offer an even more expansive approach, galvanizing communities to transform paranoia about surveillance into power and take a proactive approach to tech justice. So here's my final proposition. If it is the case that inequity and injustice is woven into the very fabric of our society, that is, we see it from policing to preschool to pop culture, then each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problems that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers. What does that look like? For starters, I think it means focusing on everyday practices and pedagogy, on the fine print, the nitty-gritty, those aspects of our work that we've been taught not to question. It involves moving beyond tokenistic inclusion and rejecting predatory inclusion, remembering that process matters as much as the endpoint, thinking carefully about whose insights and experiences we're listening to and engaging. So if, as I suggested at the start, a carceral imagination captures and contains, then a liberatory imagination can open up possibilities and pathways. It can create new settings, encode new values, and build on critical intellectual traditions that have continuously developed insights and strategies grounded in justice. And my hope is that we all find ways to build on this tradition and embrace the friction. Thank you.